Bill Brunner here for the latest instalment of my Facebook Live streaming topics. I haven't got my notes in front of me. What am I going to do? Okay, so the normal thing we start with is this is not legal advice. And if you need particular advice in relation to what we're going to talk about today, which is no job, no jab, or no jab, no job, whichever way you want to say it, then please contact us to assist you with that. Bailiwick Legal, as most of you will probably know now, we're a specialist firm dealing with primarily the agriculture and tourism sectors. But within those sectors, we deal with the usual range of commercial and employment and litigation disputes and other contractual and commercial arrangements which are not necessarily dispute orientated. So today's topic, no jab, no job. Quite a topical issue right at the moment, because there's quite a number of people, and when I say people, I mean businesses and peak bodies and the government even, with a view as to what employers typically ought to be doing in relation to the concept of no jab, no job. So what does that actually mean, no jab, no job? Effectively, that means if you don't actually have or obtain a vaccination, then the employer has no obligation to employ you. And in where this is a policy introduced by an employer, the employer will be at liberty to terminate the employment of an employee where the employee refuses or otherwise does not obtain a vaccination. So some quite significant and serious ramifications that could arise with respect to the introduction of such a policy by employers. So in looking at this topic, what I thought I'd do is just break it down into some bite-sized chunks. Firstly, what are people actually saying about this? What's the public's view? What does the Fair Work ombudsman say? What do unions say? And lastly, what is the business sector saying about this concept of no jab, no job? And then we sort of flip that and look at, well, what are some of the key issues that need to be taken into account if an employer was to introduce a policy of no jab, no job? Is there regulation for it? Is there some policy driver from the government or Fair Work, for argument's sake? And are there some safety issues? No doubt there are. Okay, so overall, if we go back to my initial points, what are people saying about it? In the context of the public, I think if those people listening read the West Australian reasonably regularly, I think it was maybe Monday's or yesterday's edition of the West had a report that something like 76% of the public think that no jab, no job is a damn good policy to have. So at least in Western Australia, the public's view is go for it. And that position seems to have some resonance, if you like, around Australia, where a hospitality group, Restaurant and Catering Australia, has also done a survey, and most of their clientele also think, I should say the majority of their clientele also think that business should introduce no jab, no job policy. So I think the popular vote is that there is no impediment, if you like, to the no jab, no job policy. Okay, so what then is the Fair Work Ombudsman saying about this? And I bring this in because of a recent report I read in the context of the Fair Work Ombudsman's view about this no jab, no job policy, and from memory, I can't remember exactly what it was, but from memory, I thought the position being adopted was rather sort of wishy-washy, in the sense it was just sitting on the fence. But I have to say that I've had some research done in relation to the Ombudsman's position, and that position looks like it ties in also with Safe Work Australia's position in this context too. So we have two sort of peak regulatory bodies, that are out there with a particular view about how employers might be able to introduce or whether they should be able to introduce the no jab, no job policy within the work environment. So if we look a bit deeper into that, Safe Work Australia is saying that in most cases it's not reasonably practicable for employers to require staff to be vaccinated. However, risk profiles of certain industries and state-based health and safety requirements may also be factors determining whether a company should actually mandate and introduce a policy. In the context of government, there is no mandated requirement for vaccination, in the sense that there's no regulation overarching that requires all employers or any particular employers to have vaccinated staff. If we flip back now to the Fair Work Ombudsman's position, perhaps somewhat contradictory, the Fair Work Ombudsman's position is that employers should not assume that they can simply introduce a policy where their employees must be vaccinated. The Fair Work Ombudsman has, though, released some guidelines, which is a 4-tier system, which they say should assist employers to determine whether such a policy could or ought be introduced, and also whether that would be lawful and reasonable to do so. So that 4-tier system probably sounds a little complex, but it's not so bad. So the first tier is where employees are required as part of their duties to interact with people with an increased risk of being infected with coronavirus. So the example here is hotel quarantine, border control, those types of roles where there's a significant risk of those people being exposed to someone who is currently infected with the virus. Tier 2 is where employees are required to have close contact with people who are particularly vulnerable to the health impacts of coronavirus, and obviously they're healthcare workers and workers in the aged care sector. And we know what the ramifications are with coronavirus through aged care centres, so that sort of is an understandable level for Tier 2. Tier 3 is where there is interaction or likely interaction between employees and other people, such as customers and consumers and other employees or the public in the normal course of employment. So retail shops is a good example of that. The fourth tier is where employees have minimal face-to-face interaction as part of their normal employment duties. And the example provided is where someone's working from home. I could say too that in the context of tier 3, you'll have some professional enterprises in there, easily doctors, dentists. They'll have patient and customer contact on a regular daily basis. Tier 4, where there's minimal face-to-face. I have no meetings today. I'm doing this Facebook Live. The only people I'm going to be interacting with today are the other people in the office here. So, solicitors, by and large, might well fall into tier 4 most of the time. All right. Out of those, we take tier 1 and tier 2, where there's more of a exposure to someone who has been infected, or there's exposure to people who are particularly vulnerable if infected. In those two tiers, an introduced policy, no job, no jab, is likely to be reasonable because there's an increased risk of infection. With respect to tier 4, unlikely to be reasonable to introduce such a policy. With tier 3, it's a bit of an ambivalent situation. There is contact with the populace that could be daily and reasonably regular, but where there's been no community transmission for some time, or you're in a lockdown situation, then the policy introduction sort of doesn't make sense and may well be seen to be unreasonable. All right, business sector. Within the business sector, I think most people would be aware that I think in the mining game, and certainly in construction, currently it's mandatory to have flu vaccination as part of the requirement to be employed. And I understand from this morning's radio report that Qantas are now making it mandatory for their frontline staff to be vaccinated, their pilots and cabin crew, because obviously they have significant contact on a day-to-day basis. We do know also that Fruit and Veg Company, SPC, has also introduced a mandatory vaccine requirement for its site, staff and visitors. So I understand there's a bit of a test case happening there, so we'll just have to watch that space, and there might be an update there. Another one within the business sector is Live Nation Concerts. That entity owns festivals like Splendour and Grass and Falls Festival, and runs other major tours in Australia. And it has just announced also that it will require vaccination or negative COVID test results for entry into their events and venues. So, and that's from October 4 this year. So we've got a situation. I mean, you look at that situation for Live Nation Concerts, and that's going to then impact upon those that can attend as well as those that are employed for any of those events. And so that, and you think about that, well, it sort of does make sense in some respects, because at those events typically you're going to have often many thousands of people attending. So the likelihood of infection is high as it stands at the moment. Unions across Australia are variously not opposed to the introduction of a no jab, no job policy. However, they do still take the view that it should be reasonable for the particular role and entity. It needs to be based on advice from health professionals, and the unions want, obviously, consultation with workers and the union movement if a company is looking to introduce it. Now, there's going to be lots of companies that have no union involvement or union people within their business. So the necessity to consult with a union is not something that we would advocate in those circumstances, but we would certainly advocate a discussion with employees by an employer in any event if the employer is considering the introduction of this type of policy. Primarily because of the substantive impact it could have on the employee or employee groups, not least of which might be issues of discrimination, which I'll come to a bit later. So some of the key issues then in relation to the introduction of this type of policy. The process of vaccination is still new. Not everyone has been vaccinated. My understanding is not everyone is eligible for vaccination at this stage. There are age bracket distinctions between the types of vaccinations you would be able to obtain at the moment, and there is also a level of insufficiency of supply of vaccinations. So there are factors clearly that would come into play with respect to the introduction of such a policy. The other factors that come into play would be those people that have a religious view about vaccinations or may be susceptible to adverse health consequences if they were vaccinated. So just on that, I've got a friend who is in remission for a particular marrow cancer, and he needed to go and check out with his doctor whether it was okay to have the AstraZeneca vaccine. So there are issues like that which employers may not be aware of, particular employees having those types of issues. So a blanket policy introduction, no jab, no job, may not work all the time, in the sense that employers would need to build in some tolerances to that type of policy to take account of situations where a particular employee may not be able to obtain a vaccination, I should say get vaccinated, because of certain peculiarities with or issues with that particular employee. So there has been some cases already, somewhat surprisingly how quickly these things get agitated in the courts. There has been some unfair dismissal cases in relation to the imposition of a policy of no jab, no job, and by and large the Fair Work Australia has actually upheld the imposition of that policy, or I should say the introduction of that policy in those particular circumstances. I won't deal with those cases, one, because they're quite lengthy, two, we don't necessarily have the time to gloss over those things, but safe to say that those cases have dealt with another issue, which is a key safety issue, which is whether having a policy, no jab, no job, reflects an inherent requirement of an employee's role. And when I think of this particular aspect, I think, well, pretty much everyone should be able to do their job without having a vaccination. Because the vaccination per se doesn't prohibit you, or a lack of having a vaccination doesn't prohibit you from actually doing your job. But the issue is somewhat wider than that, and sort of reverts back to what the Fair Work Ombudsman is saying in levels 1 and 2, particularly where there is significant human interaction, where there's a risk of infection, where there are vulnerable parties that may be infected, such as aged care centres, then the concept of inherent requirement sort of takes a secondary step, or even third or fourth down the list of matters that are significant to be taken into account. And so where someone in an aged care centre, for argument's sake, has introduced a mandatory policy, Fair Work has upheld that policy due to the issues, the more public policy issues around, rather than harping on about the inherent requirements of the job itself. So where does that really leave us? In that sense, it still leaves us in a position where it's going to depend on the individual business and the individual industry that business is in, as to whether the introduction of a mandatory policy of no jab, no job will be seen to be fair and lawful and not unreasonable. So one of the other things I touched upon earlier was this concept of discrimination. And in Australia we have many forms of discrimination, sex, disability, age, just to name a few. And so it's unlawful to discriminate against someone, particularly an employee, in relation to those three things, and a few others, of course, but if we concentrate on those things, we'll be fine for this purpose. And if we look at disability, now a disability might be a situation where a particular employee has an inherent health underlying problem, I'll call it, which would prevent the employee from getting a vaccination or getting vaccinated. Now, this inherent problem with the employee may apply across many health spectrum issues for the employee, not necessarily just COVID. So, and therefore, you've got a situation where there's an underlying inherent disability within the employee itself, and if the introduction of a policy was to force that person to be pushed out of employment, be terminated, well, it could well be seen that the policy works unfairly in those circumstances. So that's what I said earlier. If a policy is going to be introduced, there needs to be some tolerance to take account of people that may have a religious belief that prevents them from getting the vaccination. And again, you can't discriminate against someone based on their religious beliefs. They may have some inherent health issues, underlying health issues, so you can't discriminate on the basis of disability. So any policy introduced needs to have a level of tolerance. Okay, I might really probably wrap it up there. There is no overarching policy directive by government. There is no overarching regulatory regime by government which is in place at the moment, which requires all employees and employers to have a vaccination. Now, I suspect over time that position won't change. I think the government's role is probably one of trying to contain and assist employers, contain the virus, assist employers and employees and the populace generally in trying to deal with it on an economic level at the very least, rather than drilling down to the minutiae of the individual employer-employee relationship. And it seems to me that that's the relationship that prevails in this type of discussion. And there, of course, individual relationships between employer and employee, and I think at that level is where a policy needs to be introduced. And if a business is looking at introducing such a policy, I think the Fair Work Ombudsman 4-step categorisation really levels of interaction is what they are. I think that's a good place for employers to actually start in considering the introduction of a policy. Indeed, considering how that policy may be worded and introduced and enforced. So, whilst it's topical, there are many people out there that will be advocating that this should be mandatory. There are some that are advocating that it should still be voluntary, and employers shouldn't be allowed to introduce such a policy. But I think this is no different to, say, a flu vaccine policy, where some employers, typically again in construction and mining, require someone to have the flu vaccination before they're allowed to come onto site. And so it really comes down to the individual nature of the employment itself, which industry the business is operating in, and questions of reasonableness. So hopefully that has provided a little bit of insight into some of the controversial issues that prevail in this no jab, no job discussion. I'll call it a discussion. It's not really an argument. It is a discussion, and it's a worthy discussion that we need to have given the circumstances surrounding COVID. So I'll sign off there. Thank you for joining me. As always, if you need further assistance on this topic or any other issue, commercially minded employment, etc., check our website for what work we are capable and competent to do, and we look forward to having a chat with you. Thanks very much. Bye.